Next talk is by Shobini Rao. I have not time to look up her biodata. I think, yeah. Let me just take the time. Can I take your? Yes, please. I'll give it back to you. And the talk is mirroring Advaita Vedanta with cognitive neuroscience. And let me just present Shobini Rao. I hope Mrs. Rao would forgive me. She's a professor of clinical psychology at Bangalore National Institute of Mental Health and Science. And she has a PhD from Delhi University, and she has been at different parts of the world. And I don't want to read her biodata, but she's well known in her field. I have heard of her name before. So this is Shobini Rao.
I would like to thank Professor Srikantan, Dr. Anindya Sinha, and Dr. Sangeeta Menon for this kind invitation. It's a great honor to be giving a talk at this international conference. What I'm attempting to do in the next half an hour is to draw parallels between Advaita Vedanta and cognitive neuroscience. Advaita Vedanta is as ancient as you can think a discipline would be. To my recollection, it goes thousands of years behind us. Whereas cognitive neuroscience is a new kid on the block, so to say. It's an outcome of a marriage between cognitive psychology and imaging fields. So cognitive psychology came up as a revolution in psychology in the 60s, and the imaging field came into maturity in the 90s, and cognitive neuroscience has come up as an entity sometime in the 90s. So we have a late 80s, 90s onwards. We have two disciplines of thinking with different methodologies, with different aims, and there are striking similarities between the two. Now, aim of Vedanta is experience of reality or Brahman. Can I just have the pointer if you don't mind? Okay. Experience of reality or Brahman is a very experiential concept which has its objective manifestations, but the experience, the anubhaveti krama, the method is just the experience. Reality is defined as unchanging existence or truth, that is sat, whose nature is bliss or ananda, and consciousness, that is chit. So we have this concept of satchidananda as reality, and the obstacles to the experience of this reality is maya, and maya, which is commonly described as illusion, is perception of duality in the non-dual whole. So in the Purna, which is the non-dual whole, we perceive duality, and that is the Maya. And the cause of the Maya is differentiation in space and time, that is called as Deshakala Parichinna. And Maya is differentiation in name and form, or Nama Rupa Beda. So this universal reality is differentiated in space and time, differentiated in name and form to give it this perception of duality, and that is transcending that duality and realizing the non-dual reality is the aim of Vedanta. On the other hand, aim of cognitive science is understanding the mediation of cognition, affect, and volition by the brain. I am not using the word mind very deliberately because mind is not acceptable in cognitive neuroscience. We have dissected it in terms of cognition, affect, and volition. These are through three broad fields. And when I say brain, it is not just the structure and functioning of the brain, also the genetics, also the development of the brain, and so forth. Now, what are the valid means of knowledge or evidences or pramanas in Vedanta, and what are the valid means of knowledge or evidences in cognitive neuroscience? The red that you see is for cognitive neuroscience, and the black is in Vedanta. Very strikingly, these are similar. So both these systems of thought or the systems of knowledge accept pratyaksha or direct perception. The direct perception is aided by experimental evidence and naturalistic observation in cognitive neuroscience. Anumana or inference is acceptable in both. So we have inference, experimental inference, we have theoretical models as evidences of truth. Upamana or comparison, which is there in Vedanta, is also there, where we compare results of different research studies as a means of situating our finding in the body of knowledge in cognitive neuroscience. There is arthapatti or postulation. We have hypothesis formation in cognitive neuroscience and post hoc theorizing when we have gone into some sort of exploratory studies and find some truths emerging. And anupalabdhi or non-apprehension, absence of an experimental effect or absence of a brain activation as evidence of a fact, and shabda or verbal testimony that is acceptable in Vedanta, whereas in cognitive neuroscience we have it as publication in peer-reviewed journals with high impact factor, citation index, acceptance by scientific peers. So in both these systems, we have similar evidences of truth which are accepted. And method of attaining knowledge in Vedanta, I have broadly differentiated them in terms of methods based on emotion, methods based on action, methods based on just cognition, and that which integrates the body with the mind, that is the Ashtanga Yoga. So we have devotion or Bhakti Marga, which is predominantly centered on emotion. And here the division is between two methods, that is the Apara Bhakti and Para Bhakti. So I am talking of Apara Bhakti is what we see going to a temple, worshipping an idol and so on. But it is the Para Bhakti where there is a surrender with the divine, and that leads to an experience of non-duality. And you have various bhavas of this Para Bhakti, that is bhava of peace, bhava of servitude, bhava of friendship, that is Sakhya, bhava of Madhurya, that is romantic love, and bhava of Vatsalya, or that of a mother to a child. With adopting any of these bhavas, the bhakta gets into a state wherein he gradually merges himself into the non-dual whole. And of course the Nishkama Karma or desireless action, which again takes us to the non-dual whole. And Ashtanga Yoga with various 8 limbs, Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pranayama, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana and Samadhi. I will not go into the details of these, but they take the person as a whole, that is the body, the mind, the brain interacting with the environment, and various practices for, let us say, refining the body, which has an impact on the mind, that is the asana, restraints and practices, breath control, and then withdrawal of the senses, gradual honing in of attention or attentional training, then merging of the mind and complete, shall I say, transcendence into the non-dual whole. So you have this integrated approach in the Ashtanga Yoga, and a purely cognitive approach, such as the Shruti, where you listen to a teacher, you study by yourself, you reflect on what you have studied, and Ramana Maharshi's concept of self-inquiry or Atma Vichara. So any of these techniques lead us to the non-dual whole. And here we have method of attaining knowledge in cognitive neuroscience. We have naturalistic observation, that is behavior of animals, infants, children, clinical patients. We rely quite a bit on systematic observation. Behavioral experiments, the mainstay of cognitive psychology, wherein we very deliberately change a process and look at its effect in terms of reaction time and accuracy measures to see how a process can be manipulated in the laboratory. And then the recent entrant, the functional brain imaging techniques, the electroencephalogram, the magnetoencephalogram, the positive emission tomography, functional magnetic resonance imaging, optical infrared imaging, then repetitive transmagnetic stimulation, as well as recording from populations of neurons in behaving animals. Any of these give us data from which we infer the state of the brain. The premise is that different structures of the brain mediate different functions which are teased by these behavioral experiments. So you basically conduct an experiment while the brain is being imaged, and mapping these or partitioning these imaging results, you are able to see how exactly the brain is approaching the process or a process is being mediated. In spite of using these very, very different methodologies for knowledge, what we find is striking similarities in understanding the mental processes. Pardon me for the word psyche, because I am not able to get a different word apart from the word mind, and I don't want to use the word mind as yet. So if we look at the mental apparatus, both Vedanta as well as cognitive neuroscience dissect the mental apparatus. They don't think of the mental apparatus as a unified whole. They dissect it. And they dissect it in terms of the 5 sense organs or the panchendriyas, the 5 organs of knowledge, that is, of action, that is the karmendriyas. Then, I'm sorry for this word, this would be the wrong word, the memory. And the internal, this is the key here, internal representation of the world as a process of construction. So, the mental apparatus, or I'm sorry for using this, but the word mind is not a photograph of the external world. It is a construction which is being done by the brain, and it depends on your genetics, it depends on your development, it depends on your perceptions, your motivations, your goals, and the construction keeps on changing. Depending on the feedback from the environment, the construction again changes. So it's a very dynamic, active process which the brain is doing in order to represent the world, both internal as well as external. In terms of differences between these two disciplines is the mind itself. Mind, which is the antakarana of Vedanta, and as I said, cognitive neuroscience does not yet admit this word mind. We would rather use the word cognition, affect, volition, etc. Intellect, it is buddhi as per Vedanta. I will go into the details later. And then self. So in Vedanta we have the Atman, we have the Jiva, and then we have the Ahankara. Whereas in cognitive neuroscience we are yet only talking of just self. So now the mental apparatus, I'm talking of the dissection or psyche, is not unitary or homogeneous, it's a differentiated entity. So when I say a differentiated entity, it has perception as one, memory as another, intellect as third, it has goal-directed behavior as fourth, and you have various facets of it which are not necessarily identical or interrelated, but they are modular in nature, and these facets develop as the child matures into an adult. So it's not as if the child is just born with the entire thing in toto. It's a result of a maturation, and the heredity and environment influence the psyche. So we are talking of an open system where there is an allowance of the environment for influencing of the psyche, and as such there is a development which is dependent on the environment. You see it in brain maturity. In cognitive neuroscience it's very evident. There's a whole new field called developmental cognitive neuroscience, which the object of study is to show how does these faculties develop as the child matures, as the brain matures in terms of structural maturity, in terms of functional maturity. The closest to this that I see in Vedanta is the concept of our Sangha. With whom do we associate with? Is it Satsanga? Is it Mahapurusha Samshraya? It need not be only in physical contact. As scientists, we know that we are in cognitive contact with our peers elsewhere through the internet or through journals and so on. So in terms of our thoughts with which we are associating with, that seems to influence the psyche. Of course, the heredity, where we are, to whom we are born, and the genes that we inherit. Now the 5 senses of knowledge, that is the Jnanendriyas, there is similarity in both in terms of vision, audition, touch, olfaction and gustation. And here in the cognitive neuroscience, these are distinct brain systems. So distinct receptor organs in brain systems, let's say vision for example, has in the macaque about 40 different brain areas represent or process vision apart from the eyes feeding in the information. Environmental affordances, a relatively new concept in cognitive neuroscience. So a faculty develops or a function, a process can develop only if there is a possibility from the environment. If that possibility is not there, then the development itself can be stopped. And we have the concept of tanmatras, that is potentialities existing. And there is role of expectancy, experience, attention in shaping perception. And the 5 senses bring in information from the outside world and from the body to the brain or the psyche. And different brain structures and brain networks mediate each of these senses. Very surprising similarity. Please leave out this last point. But in terms of these 3 points, there is surprising similarity between Vedanta and cognitive neuroscience. Coming to organs of action or karmendriyas, that is locomotion, manipulation, speech, evacuation and procreation. Again, each has a distinct system in the brain, connecting muscle groups to the brain structures through afferent and efferent connections. Again, regulation of effort, attention and monitoring of sequences and errors is essential for action. My knowledge of Vedanta is not vast, so I will not be going into the details of how Vedanta explains this with relation to action, but definitely in cognitive neuroscience there is quite a bit of literature in terms of effects of attention and effort on action. I would be concentrating a little more on this concept of antakarana, which is the closest to the mind. Antakarana, the Vedantic view of mind is, it consists of 4 parts. That is the manas, the chitta, the buddhi and the ahankara. The manas is subtle. It is closest to Atman or the substratum of reality in its subtlety. And the purified mind is calm, steady and one-pointed. And as per the Gita, mind is purified by practice and dispassion, that is abhyasa and vairagya. This is how Vedanta explains what manas is. And the 6 enemies of this mind are the Arishad Varga, as they say. And then we have the desire, the anger, the greed, delusion, arrogance. It pushes it into ignorance or avidya. And this ignorance or avidya is again perception of duality. So the impure mind is unrestrained and jumps from one content to the next. It is not able to be one-pointed, and hence it has chanchalata or restlessness. Now when we come to buddhi as the concept from Vedanta, buddhi or intellect has the capacities for ekagrata, that is one-pointed attention. It has the capacity for grahana, that is grasping or abstraction from the environment. It has the capacity for vichara, that is debate or questioning, and viveka, that is discrimination, and prajna, that is discriminating awareness. The buddhi is expected to have all these capacities. Coming to chitta, this is the storehouse of thoughts, of persons, things and events. So the antakarana has these 4 constituents, that is the manas, the buddhi, the chitta, and last of all, ahankara. Ahankara is closest to the self of cognitive neuroscience. I sense, the sense of agency or doership, the experience, that is the karta, the bhokta, the experience of joys and sorrows, and it is also been described as the knot or the granthi between the body, which is the deha, and the atma, which is the soul. So these 4 constituents form the antakarana. Now let us look at 5 minutes. Let us look at mind from the cognitive neuroscience perspective. Mind is differentiated into cognition, affect and volition, as I said. And cognition has been explained in terms of perception, attention, memory, executive functions, intelligence, metacognition. Affect in terms of perception, expression of mood and metamood, and volition in terms of choice, inhibitory control and decision making. So the manas, as per the cognitive neuroscience perspective, is largely volition. That is inhibitory control, which has predominantly the prefrontal areas, error monitoring, conflict resolution, the anterior cingulate, the dorsolateral prefrontal areas, probability, calculation of probability of outcome, which underlies decision making, evaluation of losses and gains. Again, these 2 things, that is the calculation of probabilities and evaluation of gains and losses, they are the substratum of decision making. In terms of buddhi, we have the division in terms of the attention, intelligence and executive functions. So attention has various facets. You can see it's a very detailed explanation of attention, of intelligence, as well as executive functions, which are functions which mediate goal-directed behavior, largely mediated by the prefrontal areas. And all these 3, whether it is attention, intelligence or executive functions, develop ontogenetically and phylogenetically. So they are expressed best in the human being. The chitta, which is memory, has declarative and non-declarative components. So we have different types of declarative memory which you can declare to conscious awareness, each with its own distinct brain system. Largely the declarative memories are mediated by the cortical areas and the non-declarative by the subcortical areas. Now in terms of ahankara, the distinction between ahankara or ego, and this is also called as the false I, and the atma or self, that is the true I, is not present in cognitive neuroscience. The self of cognitive neuroscience is closest to ahankara of Vedanta. As per cognitive neuroscience, these are fairly recently emerging in the 2000s. Self is not an indivisible all or a unitary single entity. It emerges gradually. Its origin can be explained both from developmental perspectives of psychology and from developmental cognitive neuroscience. And our own identity can be dissected into component parts. Each part can be studied separately. According to the editorial of Nature Neuroscience in 2002, the editor terms this as revolutionary ideas which would take time to accept. We are only talking of ego here. Here are the different facets of the self: representation, monitoring, evaluation, integration, self-awareness, unity, agency, spatial perspectivity, ownership, mind reading, emotion, autobiographical memory, as per Northoff and Wormhole in Trends in Cognitive Sciences in the year 2004. What gave a huge fillip to the studies of self was the discovery of the default mode network. I would not use the word discovery, the description of the default mode network by Rakel and his colleagues starting from around 2001. The default mode network is a network which is shown as activations in the fMRI studies while the person is at rest. He is not doing any task, he is in the resting phase. Previously it was thought as an error, as a noise which has to be subtracted out. But later on Rakel said, no, there is something going on there. Why should we subtract it? Let us study it. And what has also happened is the self is described as the process which emerges when the default mode network is active. Also in fMRI judgments of adjectives as describing oneself, that is self-referential judgments versus other referential judgments, or looking at one's own face, comparing it with compared with another's face. So whenever we are reflecting on our own self, certain areas become active. Now these default mode network are high metabolic rate or activations in the medial prefrontal areas and posterior cingulate areas. So medial, this is called medial frontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate being the characteristic nodes of the default mode network. And there is a high connectivity between the emotional regions of the brain, that is the limbic areas and the midline frontal areas. Any externally oriented task which requires attention disturbs or shuts down the default mode network. Hence, there is a negative correlation between attentional networks and dorsolateral prefrontal regions. And this has been described Gausnard, that is along with Rakel, as well as Carter, Harris and Friston. This brain article is very interesting because they have tried to link psychoanalysis with self and default mode network and the limbic activations. Here is an example of default mode network. Here is the orbito-medial prefrontal cortex, the dorsal medial prefrontal, the anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate areas, which are mediating different functions of representation, evaluation, monitoring and integration whenever the person judged his some adjectives as referring to himself or to another. Just 2 minutes. Can I take 2 minutes? I'll just sum up. And this is another, I will not go into this. So, transcendence of this ahankara using meditation as a training of attention. Distinct structural and functional brain changes are associated with meditation, and Buddhist compassion meditation have shown activations in right anterior insula in expert meditators. Again, right insular cortex with insight meditation has also been shown. The default mode network is activated, or rather it is deactivated, that is, it is shutting down during various types of meditation. And in expert meditators, there is a coupling between the attentional centers and the posterior cingulate areas, part of the default mode network. Hence, if we think of default mode network as the network which enables this restless mind to be active, expert meditation, here is a very interesting study. I think just the previous lecture professor asked whether awareness can be studied in imaging. Here is an example of awareness being studied. Expert meditators are just focusing on their breath, and whenever they find their mind is wandering, they have to press a button. And the activations are compared between when they press a button and when they are not pressing the button. And we find that the default mode network is active during mind wandering, whereas in salience network is activated while they are aware of the mind wandering. So you have this awareness, the sustenance, and the restlessness being able to be differentiated in the brain activations. So in terms of macro principles of mind functioning, the similarities are in terms of modularity of the functions, the interconnectedness between the functions. Attention does influence perception, perception does influence emotion. The world as a construction by the mind and the brain. Rather, the mind is a construction and the brain is constructing this, and there is experience dependent plasticity, both at the neurological level as well as in terms of the cognitive or the mental aspects, and the person is goal directed. The goals may be different. The goals may be what we choose. It could be realization of the Atman, or it could be sensory gratification, or just delivering the lecture on time, but there is a goal directedness to it. Thank you, sir.
We have 12 minutes for questioning.
Professor Sriram Murthy from Dayalbagh Educational Institute, Center of Consciousness Studies, Agra, Dayalbagh. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that the cognizer is always taken as the Atma, that is Jnanadhikaranam Atma, and also Prajnanam Brahma. And Antahkaran is a unitary aspect. It is not a checkered one. And this Mano, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahankar, they are only aspects of it. And Ahankar being the first. And then it's also said in the Kathopanishad that Atmendriya Manoyuktam Bhoktetya Manishna. Bhokta is Jnata also, experiencer. So these ideas, if you take into consideration into your neuroscience also, if you dissociate the spirit aspect of it, and we, as long as we consider that Indriyas and Manas are the cognizers, I think we go nowhere. Thank you.
Yes, actually, yes. Yes, sir. What neuroscience currently is doing is it has recognized the existence of the self. That itself is a major achievement. And that self has been situated in the brain in the default mode network as well as in the lateral temporal and inferior parietal cortices. In terms of differentiation between the knower, whether it is the Atman or whether it is the Ahankar, that is not the point. Knowledge or the process of knowing itself is differentiated. And the Sakshi Bhava that you are talking about, the awareness or the Sakshi Bhava, that still hasn't come under the study.
I am Shilpa Pandit. I am an independent researcher. I have an observation to share, ma'am. You compared self-experience as pratyaksha with naturalistic observation, and you also said that it's related with experiments on animals, infants and children. I have 2 points here. One is that when we are observing animals, infants and children, we are still inferring from their experience, which is different from self-experience. And second, in self-experience, there is a simultaneous experience and what is that called? There is a direct, there is simultaneity of experience and knowledge together. So right now I'm talking with you, I'm experiencing you, and I'm understanding you also at the same time, which is different from naturalistic observation. So this was just an observation. Thank you.
Is there a question? No. Yes, please. Would you identify yourself?
I am Judu Ilavarasu. I am from SBSI Yoga University, Bangalore. And I have a small question. In Vedanta, when we talk about various means of knowledge, one of the things is we take something for antakarna which is very pure and purified. To that such kind of antakarna, what is revealed, and which is again told as a verbal testimony, that is considered as a perfect pramana. In cognitive neuroscience in modern times, do we have anything similar like that? And another thing is, have we included this part, that is as a scientist or as a researcher, have we cared to take care of our antakarna, that how purified it is? Because if as a researcher, if I have a purified antakarna, then only the knowledge that I get will be valid.
Sir, let me answer. Number one, in Vedanta, the person is his own laboratory. Your mind is your laboratory. So the purification is, to what degree of accuracy can I fine-tune my mind or purify my chitta or whatever. Whereas in cognitive neuroscience, in any science, the laboratory is outside. You're an observer, you're observing phenomena to the degree of fineness of measurement. I mean, we saw Professor Hameroff's video of microtubules, and what I showed you was very gross in terms of brain structures. So the location of observations or the method of experimentation is different, number one. Number two, yes, in science we do have this purification of antakarna. That is what is objectivity of science. The whole question of the objectivity of the scientist is the purification, that my own biases should not influence my observations. That is why in science it's very important the results are repeatable. After all, what are the tenets of science? It has to be repeatable, it has to be measurable, repeatable and predictable. Correct?
Thank you.
I'm Satyamurthy. I'm the Principal Secretary Water Resources from Karnataka. The self, the slide said self grows, which I fear is not a correct statement, because self is indestructible. Maybe self evolves, and the words cannot explain what is self. So I have a little problem there in understanding. If you are identifying self with Atman, and also if you are talking self at a very higher level with Paramatma and the other Atma concept is not just individual at an individual level. And when you really look at human being as a light and sound concept, then little difficult to understand.
No, sir, I'm sorry to interrupt. The self that cognitive neuroscience talks about is not the Atman. The self is an entity where there is a sense of agency, where there is a sense of an experiencer, not the Atman of Vedanta. In cognitive neuroscience, to accept the presence of that self, which I think is closest to ego or ahankara, that itself is a revolutionary concept as per the editor of Nature Neuroscience. So we are in cognitive neuroscience perspective, we are not talking of the spiritual world or the Atman or the universal entity, nothing at all. For the want of a better word, we are using the word self. Please don't think these are identical.
But the Vedic literature and the English literature, then we need to define what we mean by self.
Vedic literature is very clear. In the cognitive neuroscience experimentation, we haven't been able to address that universal self as yet. I think we will someday, but not today.
Because again, the Mano, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahankar, from that backdrop and from that context, the way of defining self, including the neurosciences, have to really understand it. Sure. Otherwise, we will be confusing between these words. Again, at the higher level of conceptualization and cognition, the words have no meaning.
May I interject? Privilege of the chairman. The way you have so nicely explained self, and the way I have introduced self, the fundamental difference is, yes, the fundamental difference is, I do not take for granted automatically that this microscopic self that I need to create meaningful information has a macroscopic average. And until you have that, you cannot say self is doing this or self is doing that. Self is simply a microscopic operator which is producing so many different things in the brain, joys and sorrows and all that. It's only when it becomes macroscopic that you can come to terms with things in Vedanta or even our day-to-day life observations. So one has to be very careful. Self as a microscopic concept neither grows nor goes away. It is there always in its three different aspects, creating, destroying, and preserving information in different sensory channels. Only when it has a macroscopic average, and that you have to define under what conditions, can we talk about self in a more mundane or even Vedantic way, I would think. I think one should be very careful about self and not put it in a sauce everywhere, you know.
No, sir. If I can reply.
Do I make myself clear?
To the extent that I have understood, if I can reply. The thing is, the self that I refer to in the cognitive neuroscience literature is the perception or the description that the person gives of phenomena which pertains to himself. And during that phase, what areas of the brain are active compared to when he gives the descriptions about some other person. That is one differentiation. Another differentiation is there is no task, he is not sleeping, he is just lying down in the scanner. What are the areas which are active?
Sure.
Okay, so it is like a mind wandering is one description, self-referential thinking is another description. So self is used in this sense, not in the sense of the Vedantic concept. I'm sorry if I didn't come through clearly in my talk, but what I want to emphasize is that cognitive neuroscience has now recognized the need for positing a self, not from the Vedantic perspective, but I think up to the level of ahankara at least we have reached, though the sense of agency is not clearly yet understood.
I think we have one last question, very short question, and a short answer, please.
I just had one question. In the sense, the two sciences that we are talking about have different basic premise or tenets, so to say. That is, one is towards the self, the other, as you mentioned earlier to another person who asked a question, that the laboratory is self, the other is outside.
The quick answer is, in spite of the difference in aim, difference in methods, difference in philosophy, there are striking similarities.